is the rational part of our brain alone. But for others, the soul remains worth searching for.
There's a good reason we have these two words, self and soul. There clearly are two different kinds of processes which feel very differently to us introspectively. On the one hand, we have the self, which uses language and thinks rationally. And on the other hand, we have these moments of insight, creativity, and they feel completely different.
There is nothing scientifically useful that can be said about the soul after death. But the soul of the living is another matter. And the search for that is gathering pace. In the modern world, the idea of the soul has been overwhelmed by the self and its works. The material, the logical, the scientific have so transfixed us, possessed our minds so completely, that often we don't even feel the need to see past them, nor imagine any other reality. But there are some scientists who say that we let this happen at our peril.
I think the key thing about the self is that it can be a very circumscribed phenomenon, and I think it's essential to the idea of the soul that it is not in that way circumscribed. The self in modern life can often be simply an aggregate of present wishes and desires and conscious plans, and can see itself as a functional unit in a very functional world. And I think people have been deceived into thinking that because we are able to understand certain things quite practically for certain purposes so that we can exploit them, we can understand them using a very simple model, a mechanistic model, which is the worst kind of scientific model, that ourselves should follow this pattern.
But whether we like it or not, our materialistic and scientific culture has whittled away at our sense of having an inner core to who and what we are. In last week's program, we explored the work of Michael Gazzaniga, who believes that our sense of self is simply the result of the left side of our brain creating order out of the jumble of our experiences.
Ultimately, they're circuits. That's the assumption of neuroscience. There's a circuit in there that finds you, the self, always asking the question, why did I do that? What's the meaning of this? It's constantly trying to seek patterns, seek understanding towards our actual behavior, felt states, and all the rest. It's trying to tell a story that's consistent with what's going on. And that becomes the narrative. That becomes the self-story of who we are and what we're doing and how we're interacting throughout life.
So the self, says Gazzaniga, is like a computer chip, tucked away inside our brain, making sense of the confusion of our neural experiences.
That chip, that interpreter chip, that little wiring is in our left hemisphere. I think the subtleties of the human condition in terms of thought and rationality are all left hemisphere-based events. It is the thinking, language-based, hypothesis-generating hemisphere. It is the one that does the heavy lifting for our cognitive life.
It was this sort of reductionism that prompted Ian McGilchrist to study psychiatry. He agreed that the interpreter exists, but believes it is only part of our essence.
Gazzaniga has written about the interpreter and produced some very interesting evidence, which he interprets, it seems to me, in a way that isn't justified by the evidence. He sees it, this interpreter, as being the thing that is actually us and is our consciousness. And it is, for certain purposes, what rules the roost. But it isn't the whole of the self at all. The two hemispheres have evolved to capture a different model, if you like, of the world, to capture a different aspect of existence. And they both have realities that they can show us. The left hemisphere tends to see a thing as bits of things that don't necessarily cohere at all, and is most at home, actually, with things that present themselves as rather novel lumps of little bits. Whereas the right hemisphere has more of a gestalt feel of things. It sees things in the whole rather than simply as parts. It sees things in context. For example, if I say to you, it's rather hot in here, you understand that what I mean is, could you please open the window? That level of understanding of language is what goes on in the right hemisphere. It understands what people mean when they say things, taking into account everything we know. Whereas the left hemisphere is still busy looking words up in the dictionary and putting them together using, that's a bit of a generalization, but that is the general idea. It's not just language, it's everything that we do. The left brain on its own, left to its own devices, it's like one of those people that you ask directions. They don't know the directions. They're damned they're going to say they don't know the directions. They'd rather tell you to go somewhere else and save the face than actually helpfully say, I don't really know. But it's not in the vocabulary of the left hemisphere, I don't really know. What I'm trying to suggest is that this interpreter in the left hemisphere is a bit of a jumped-up individual who has, if you like, taken upon himself to say that this is what the world is, this is the way the world is. Whereas in fact our bodies, our emotions, things that are outside of our consciousness, and so on will quickly tell us that that isn't all that there is.
Once it was in monasteries, not hospitals or labs, where people sought answers to questions of this sort about our mind and our being. The method for such investigation then was prayer. And even in the modern world, pockets of such inquiries still exist.
A lot of prayer is a question of gathering myself back together again. You are trying to focus your attention on awareness and focusing then a little bit on the you that is aware. Now for me this is well, let us call it the soul. Augustine in the Confessions talks about this return into oneself and an awareness of a light above the mind, as it were, which gives a sense for him of God's presence to the mind. But for me the interesting thing is it's by the light of that presence he is aware of anything that is. Awareness is something which is, if you like, metaphysically prior to that of which I am aware.
So in the language of religious experience as well, there are two distinct parts to us. They also believe, behind the busy rational self, there is something else, without which the self cannot exist. The paradox is that it's impossible to see this essential soul directly. We can only sense its presence from what it illuminates.
I understand the idea of soul as something with which I am aware of what is. The intuitive, that with which one has insights.
I think that's a wonderful hypothesis generated by the interpreter to explain some transcendent state someone feels it sometimes. Some people it's jogging, some people it's the evening martini, some people it's meditating, reading a good book, going for a walk. It's great. It's all part of the human story, but I don't think we need another concept for it.
The idea that, there is no, so that's just a nice comforting myth, is exactly what you would expect. That hemisphere, that construction of the world, to say about it. But it has only one way of looking at things. And in the end, there is no way that you can prove to somebody that there is a soul. You have to make a leap of the imagination, an important idea, which is, I think, essential to all forms of understanding. That you have to take a leap of faith, if you like. That is something that I don't expect somebody who had a rigorously scientific materialist view of the world to hold with, of course. It's not coherent in their terms. I accept that. What I have a problem with is that the left hemisphere tends to have an interest, it seems to me, in keeping what's going on in the other hemisphere quiet. Because it's rather inconvenient having this right hemisphere reminding one that there is another world out there that has allegiances to other things in the spiritual realm. The whole purpose of literature and art, and of course of religion, is to keep in our minds that there are things outside of the world that we have created. That is not a very convenient thing to square with our rational utilitarian system. But in our own time, basically the left hemisphere has, if you like, pissed on the world of the right hemisphere.
But this is only in the West. Elsewhere, the left hemisphere has not run rampant, and the right hemisphere is alive and well. In any culture, the vision of who we are is intimately tied up with the methods employed to investigate it. In the West, our tools are logic and experiment, so our vision of the self is limited to what reason can uncover. In the East, the methods are radically different, and so are the answers.
What we're really good at in the West, and it's good that we're good at it, is you stop something to find out how it works. You hold the world still and try and manipulate particular variables to find out what effect they have, independent of everything else. And there's plenty of good reasons for doing that. But in the process of doing that, you miss how the whole moves and changes. And I would say it's one of the strengths of Buddhist traditions, which after all are 2,500 years old, are critical, systematic, cumulative, well documented. It's one of their great offerings, I think, to Western mind scientists, that they have a way of investigating the mind, engaging with it as it goes on, without stopping it to find out whether this or that variable has this or that effect.
Western science gives primacy to verifiable experience. So the left hemisphere of our brain, busily interpreting our experiences, is what matters. That's all there is to the self. The Buddhist method, meditation, goes the opposite way. Experiences are a distraction. Our essence lies beyond them.
The purpose of meditation is to disconnect, disassociate, cut off from the all external world. The mind becomes sharper and lighter later, and finally, eventually, this so-called mind is no more there. It will disappear. In the deepest meditation, there is no mind, nobody. That's why we call it the last experience in meditation is no experience, because the experiencer is no more. It gets dissolved.
People from the West think Buddhism is about bells and smells. It's about shaven-headed monks and mysticism and so on and so forth. And there is that in it, of course. But in addition, there's a systematic, critical, cumulative and testable set of claims about the mind. And they're known in a different sort of way. They're known through practice.
The purpose of meditation is to get to where the rational self doesn't exist, a state of no self. To Western ears that sounds empty and passive, but the Buddhists see it differently. No self has its own kind of intellect, they say, closer to the true genius of our minds. And the few Western scientists who are experienced meditators agree.
Zen is really concerned with insight, the kind of insights that are the peak moments in the whole creative process in general. And they have a completely different feel from ordinary thought processes. And they are usually moments when no self is in the picture at all.
Professor James Austin is an eminent neuroscientist who has also spent nearly 30 years practicing Buddhist meditation. His purpose is to translate what he finds into language his Western colleagues understand.
It's hard to define Zen. Very hard. Zen is seeing things as they really are. And that means seeing and understanding things without going through a lot of self-reflective intellectualization. For example, when we look at this stone, in the first few milliseconds of perception, before we wonder whether it's an igneous or a sedimentary or a metamorphic, we see the stone as it really is, the thing in itself, before we intrude ourselves into the picture with all kinds of language and intellectual constructs and so forth. And it's that kind and that quality of perception that Zen is oriented toward.
Austin believes the value of meditation is that it allows the mind to embrace ideas without needing to articulate, analyze, or dissect them.
For a thing to be seen as it really is, the self has to be out of the picture. Because if the self is in the picture, it stands in front of the object. One image that is often used in Zen is that of the moon being reflected on a pond. If there is emotional turmoil disturbing the surface of the water, then there will be no accurate, true reflection. If, on the other hand, that surface of the water is absolutely calm and undisturbed, the reflection will be equally clear and accurate. In this moment, there is no sense of self. Attention is focused on what is out there without any reference back to what is inside. And only then, only when one has gone into this experience, lost the sense of physical self, lost the sense of psychic self, only then, on emergence from this, does one say, hey, all of that stood in the way of my really seeing the world as it really is.
In the deepest level, nothing. Nothingness is, you can say that if at all you are there, you are nothingness. And that's what you experience. It's very difficult to explain to others also when you come back. You know, sometimes in deep meditation, you experience this nothingness, what we call this samadhi. You are no more there. But again, you will come back to conscious. Again, you will come back to the world and you will be talking with people. And that experience you had before you getting dissolved or after getting dissolved, you cannot explain to others. Each person has to practice meditation and reach to that.
What Buddhists are talking about is exploring what happens in our mind when it is not in the grip of the rational left hemisphere. The question is whether what we glimpse in that moment of meditation is evidence of some part or some process within the brain we could usefully call the soul. In the Himalayas, away from the noise and confusion of the Western world, it is easy to feel there is a place in nature beyond logic and analysis. But the task for soul searchers is to find some way of demonstrating this that makes sense to Western science. Underpinning our science for centuries have been the assumptions that the universe is built of a framework of logically interconnected mathematical laws, and the brain was a computational device within it. But now, both propositions are under attack.
Well, many people hold the idea that we are basically nothing more than computers, that all our feelings are some kind of computational activity. This view I don't hold with at all. I think there's something completely different going on. There's no reason whatsoever to believe that a computational activity can simply evoke mental qualities. I think the reason people think this is they can't think of anything else. They think that, okay, I have mental qualities, and there are these things that seem to do things a little bit like what brains do, these computers, and therefore that must be the answer.
Penrose believes people have made this false analogy because they are locked into the idea that the universe itself is logical and computational.
They say, well, surely you're just made of these atoms and so on, and you are behaving according to the same physical laws that my computer is behaving according to. Well, the main problem with that is we don't know what physical laws are. It's not a normal view coming from a physicist that there should be these profound unknowns. I mean, a lot of people will try to say, well, we don't completely understand all the laws, but we pretty well know what's going on. There are certain things we don't understand about particle physics or about the universe as a whole. But they don't tend to say there's something profoundly missing in the physical laws at a level of relevance to how we ourselves operate, whereas I think there is.
Why?
Well, why I think there's something missing comes from my attempts to understand, if you like, quantum mechanics.
For decades, leading physicists like Penrose have been grappling with a massive problem in our understanding of the world. For there is one set of laws for the ordinary world we can see, another for what's called the quantum world of the atom. But if you try to apply the rules of one world to the other, it doesn't work. And this gap may be critical to our understanding of the brain.
Quantum mechanics tells us that a photon or an electron can be in two places at the same time, or two states at the same time. People have normally assumed that this is true of the microcosm, the kind of thing that particle physicists and so on study, but it's not true of the macrocosm.
But logically, that's messy, and physicists have been struggling to discover what links the two together.
It is, in fact, very difficult to get a consistent theory which tells us that at the microcosm you can have these weird states, but not at the level of human beings. If the same rules that apply to the microcosm apply to the macrocosm as well, if that is true, then we must think of our own lives not so much as a single line in space-time, but a line which is constantly branching. And one way to look at it is that there's this sideways counterpart of time, that just as you can be in different states at different times, so you can be different states at the same time with respect to an extra dimension.
Now, there's something wrong there. my view is that at a certain level, things are going to change, that the laws of quantum mechanics are not completely accurate at all levels.
Penrose is convinced that quantum mechanics is the key to explaining the part of the mind which isn't logical, because nothing else in physics can. Quantum mechanics is the one place where scientists know something fundamental is missing.
And I have reasons to believe that the physics that we miss here, which is quite fundamental, is also the same physics, or it's the same physics which is made use of by the phenomenon of consciousness. I don't want to say it's the same as consciousness, but it's whatever consciousness is, it depends upon that missing part of physics.
Even though we do not understand the quantum world, we are using it to build quantum computers. And while Penrose is convinced that our minds are more than computers, they do give us a hint of how powerful the quantum world could be if it had a role in the workings of the mind.
A normal computer we think of as being made of basically silicon chips. That's how they're all built today. The quantum computer, however it's going to be built, is going to look rather different. This is ours. You can see the heart of it here. This small tube, it contains some molecules in here. These molecules contain atoms which have atomic nuclei, and those atomic nuclei, if you put them in a magnetic field, they tend to line up with the field rather like a compass needle. If it lines up with the field, we call that 0. Against the field, we call that 1. And that's how you build any computer, just zeros and ones. We put them in the magnet over there. It just goes down in the middle here. And then we can fire various radio waves at it to control it, and we listen to the radio signal that comes out of it at the end. And that tells us how the calculation has gone. It turns out you can solve calculations which are beyond the reach of really any conceivable classical computer. That is, if you converted, for example, the whole Earth into one large computer and ran it for 10 billion years, there are problems that that device couldn't solve, which a quantum computer with a few hundred qubits could solve quick as you like, really.
Quantum computers are not only fast, they also seem to be able to solve problems in fewer steps than logic tells us is possible, alighting on an answer as though out of nowhere. But in quantum talk, it's not out of nowhere, but out of everywhere.
Well, the question is how you understand how this calculation is being done. And one way of understanding it is to say that this computer exists in many different parallel universes. In one universe it's in state 0, in another it's in state 1, another it's in state 2, and so on. So that it's something which is doing a million different calculations at once. In fact, it exists in a million universes, in each one of which it's doing one calculation. They would all be in Oxford. Some would be in this Oxford, some would be in another Oxford, and so on. There would, of course, be an infinite number of Oxfords which were doing different calculations for us. And then all the answers somehow have to be brought back together. However, you don't have to believe in the parallel universes to see that it works. The equations tell you that it works, and that the universes are only there for explanation.
Quantum computation is just a small part of the strange world of the atom. Penrose is convinced that quantum mechanics does have a role in the brain, but that it's somewhere far beyond what we currently know.
It could be that the brain does operate as a quantum computer at a certain level. But to say that our brains were quantum computers would not get us out of the problems which I voiced before about non-computability. I'm claiming that understanding is a quality which requires us to go outside the limitations of computational activity. So we need to go beyond present-day quantum mechanics. Well, we're probing the unknown here. I mean, it's in my opinion, it's deeply connected with what the phenomenon of consciousness is about. That you need to be aware of something before you can understand something. what I mean by understanding, and I'm not going to define it because I think it's one of these qualities which is still, we don't really know what it is. But understanding, to me, genuine understanding is something which would just not be present without consciousness.
The method could not have been more different than Buddhist meditation, but the conclusion is very similar, that there has to be an essential ingredient to our being, which is not circumscribed by logic and computation, but which is fundamental to them. Paradoxically, it is mathematics which may hold the proof. Science has come a full circle. Once we explained the universe as clockwork, because Newtonian physics was all we had. Then we discovered a brave new world inside the atom, but still relied on computation and logic. Now Penrose is convinced that we must make another Einstein-like leap beyond the limits of our current science if we want to find our souls.
Well, I have a much stronger reason for believing that at least some of our conscious activity is not the result of computation. And this comes from certain very precise theorems in mathematical logic, which basically tell you that there are proved to be things within mathematics which are outside computation.
This conflicts with one of the deepest assumptions of Western science, which is that all truths are logically connected, and therefore our minds discover these truths in logical, computable steps. Greg Chaitin's work is in the process of sweeping all of this away.
I was always interested in crazy ideas. As a child, it was magic. Magic stories that interested me as a very small child. It was the notion that everyday normal reality, the reality of normal appearances, isn't the real reality, that there is something behind it, something that transcends our normal reality. And that's an impulse which can lead to religion or it can lead to science. The old view was that there were a few principles that all mathematicians could agree on, very simple, self-evident truths. And from this, you can systematically deduce things that aren't self-evident. And Gödel in 1931 pulled out the rug from under this view, showing that there would always be mathematical truths that escaped, that somehow you couldn't get to. I'm trying to understand if the cases where mathematical reasoning fails, if the problems that escape our ability as mathematicians are unusual, or if they're everywhere, if we're likely to be stumbling them on them all the time without realizing it. And my work tends to suggest that the problem is much more serious. I found accidental mathematical facts, mathematical truths which are true for no reason, which are true by accident. It's as if pure mathematics or God in the world of mathematics is just tossing a coin. And that's not supposed to happen. You see, you have all of mathematical truth, this ocean of mathematical truth. And this ocean has islands, an island here, algebraic truths, an island here, arithmetic truths, an island here of the calculus. And these are different fields of mathematics where all the ideas are interconnected in ways that mathematicians love. They fall into nice interconnected patterns. But what I've discovered is there's all this sea around these islands. The sea is full of little points where individual atomic mathematical facts which have no connection with any island. It's just one molecule, one atom of mathematical truth.
While logic prevails within each island, the mystery that fascinates Chaitin is how the human brain gets from one island to another, if not by logic.
If we're trying to get to this information, if we're trying to learn more mathematics, if we're trying to come up with new mathematical concepts, the question is, how can we do it? Where does this come from? You don't get it mechanically by reasoning based on what you already know, because in a sense, that doesn't get you anything new.
Doesn't get you off your island.
That's right. You stay in the same island. I mean, you can do a lot of beautiful mathematical theories that way, but now we know that there are certain limitations, that you're stuck.
Chaitin's work has been catastrophic for the traditional view of mathematics. But an even more profound challenge is to the dominant role of the left, the reasoning side of our brain. For if mathematical truths are not linked by logic, then the mind can't be getting from one to another by using it. This means there has to be some other hugely powerful part of the brain that is completely unlike the left hemisphere.
The normal view of how the mind works, the rational view of how the mind works, is that when you're thinking, you are making deductions. It's a symbolic process of reasoning, of using logic step by step. This is the idea that thinking is mathematical, that thinking is logical. And my impression is that this tells us something about the mind, all this work on the foundations of mathematics. And what it tells us is that logic can only be a part of it. And I think if you ask, the person in the street, they'll say logic is a very small part of human existence. And mathematicians and philosophers following Plato probably took reasoning and logic a little too seriously. I love reasoning and logic, I'm a mathematician. But in a way, mathematics is finally forced to confront its own limitations and is even underlining and proving that this view has certain limitations and that there has to be more there.
What that more is, we do not yet fully understand. But a scientist's description of what it's like in action can sound more like revelation than reason.
It's imagination. Now, I'm not saying that it's unfettered imagination. I don't know where ideas come from. I can only look back at my own experience creating a new mathematical theory and say, I don't know where it comes from. I don't do it mechanically. Most people think mathematicians, are like machines. We sit down with a piece of paper, we're dull, unemotional people, and you calculate. But the truth is, at least for me, mathematics isn't that way at all. It's very emotional. And you have these wild ideas, you have these intuitions, and thoughts come to you. Sometimes it's an extremely intense experience. I'm talking about moments where you get an idea for a whole new theory or something really major. And I've often compared this to climbing on top of a mountain, and you get to the top, and everything seems so clear and bright. And I think it's definitely a different kind of a mental state, because my mind seems much sharper. This usually goes on for a certain period, and it's not just for my mathematical work. My mind seems sharper, and I seem more perceptive about everything. I seem to be in some kind of a highly energized or more perceptive state, and it's a wonderful state to be in. It doesn't last long usually.
How does it feel?
It feels wonderful. My normal self. It's unpleasant then to go back to being your normal self. Like it's unpleasant when you've been at the top of a mountain, and the air is so beautiful, dark blue, and you can see forever. It's very unpleasant going back down into the soupy, dirty air.
The irony of Chaitin's work is that he is using the tools of advanced mathematics to prove that mysteries like inspiration and insight must be real, that they come to us from outside the self and the logic of the left hemisphere, and correspond to how artists describe the thing we all have at times: inspiration.
There's this kind of deep cave at the back of the head, and what we're doing when we're writing is bringing a feeling, an inarticulate feeling, more nearly towards the front of our minds, and as it approaches the front of our minds, words begin to attach themselves to it. So writing, making something, starts with an inchoate feeling, strictly a feeling. And what you end up with in the poem is a kind of washing line on which the words are hanging, and those words both describe, as nearly as they can, though they never do it adequately, this thing which is in the back of your head and that you're trying to bring forward. And that inarticulate back of the mind feeling is where soul lives. Oddly, while that's actually going on, I think you are largely unconscious. while we're actually on the job, if you like, actually with our hands on the page writing the thing, or painting it, or doing the complicated mathematical equation, or whatever it might be, that we are sort of blank to ourselves, but that when we've done it and seen how it's worked, if it's worked well, then you can see that that's what's happened. I think it is my experience that I'm in a sense blank to myself. It's only later that I can see it. In other words, once again, I can't report on it exactly.
This strange absence of self in the creative and intuitive process echoes the Buddhist belief that the non-self is more important than the self of the left hemisphere. Some Western mind scientists are trying to marry these strands together to reach a better definition of what makes us who we are.
There is a certain feeling on the part of the self that everything interesting that goes on, everything that is done, every behavioral decision is made by the self. But I think in an important way, the bit of the brain that does the talking isn't the part of the brain where the most interesting things occur. My own view is that the moments of insight or creativity, which I find most interesting, are those which are probably happening far off somewhere in the parts of my brain where I'm simply not aware of them until they bubble up as an almost completed thought or a partial insight, which I may then be able to sharpen or hone through the part of me that does the talking, as it were. When those two are combined, you get something very powerful.
The brain, there's the part of the brain that leads to bridge building and computers, and unfortunately accounting and inland revenue and the complications of the legal system. And then there's the part of the brain that has poetry and art and perhaps religion or spirituality, if you have those feelings, you know, that deals with art galleries, the part of you that falls in love, the modern world, modern education has trained us to emphasize this part of our personality, the rational part, the reasoning part, the mechanical part in a way. It's done great things. You have bridges and computers and modern technology, but I think this part is even more wonderful. You need them both.
Certainly there's an important role for the self, otherwise it wouldn't have evolved in the first place. But it didn't evolve to create brilliant insights or music or art or poetry. It evolved to do more mundane things like identifying food and communicating efficiently with other members of our species. So it's not surprising that the self, which is doing these more mundane activities, but doing it in particularly efficient and highly effective ways, it's no surprise that that self isn't the same thing which produces the brilliant insights or the moments of creativity.
Consciousness, by this definition, is that other thing. Not just being alive, but those things we have always felt the soul gave us. Inspiration and insight beyond logic. Roger Penrose is not religious, and he does not believe in an immortal soul. But his search has taken him very close to the language of religion.
Well, as a scientific problem, the consciousness problem is the more profound, because we have no clue. Whereas the embellishments of that problem, if you like, and the sort of self-reflective aspect you can't even get started on until you've got consciousness there in the first place. The consciousness is a gift. You can think of it that way, perhaps. Consciousness is a gift in the sense that, well, we wouldn't be here without it, and it's given to us. What I mean is that, you know, we come into this world and we seem to possess this thing of consciousness. Whereas the ability to reflect on one's own consciousness is something you've done yourself. You've thought about this. You've thought this through, in a sense. I mean, if you were a deity trying to design a universe, what ingredients would you have to put into that design for a universe in order that these beings in it actually have consciousness? We haven't the remotest clue.
I think that the science of the future, which is going to deal with complex systems, not with the hydrogen atom or the solar system, it's going to deal with things like us, hopefully, if we're lucky and we get to understand that, is going to deal with the notion of information as an absolutely fundamental notion. And I think the soul, if there is such a thing, I think is probably closer to information than it is to traditional physics that thinks about matter.
Faced with a gap in our knowledge, whether it's the missing physics of the atom or the missing element in our understanding of consciousness, one recourse is to do better science. Bad science is to say because your theory can't contain it, it can't exist. And soul is the word that has always reminded us that we are larger than any theory.
If you want to delve deeper into the history of the soul, visit the Believe It or Not website at channel4.com/culture. And next Sunday at 8, a personal and controversial view on why globalisation is good. Now next on 4, the story of a special relationship that turned sour when David Beckham met Alex Ferguson.
I think you should stand for the leadership, Gordon. With me as your deputy.
Why would I stand only to lose?
I don't think you would lose.
Will they run against each other?
No, I don't believe they will. They agree on so much that they would want to consider who will play best at the box office.
Have we come this far to see the Labour Party led by a Tory?
Well, is it true?
I'm still thinking.
Well, why you were thinking did it occur to you that the two of us have an understanding?
What understanding?
That I was the senior partner, and if it ever came to this, it would be me.
I think we should meet. I sense this is a crucial moment, not just for us, for us all.
The Deal, coming soon on 4.
Get your Champions League handbook free with the game, only in Monday's Times.
Introducing the Power Mac G5, the world's fastest, most powerful personal computer.
It's 1 year on and the restaurant's a success, but are Jamie's kids up to scratch?
99% of people are happy. I've just complained and cooked food, maybe 98. Are you completely stupid? They're probably going to stink of onions now. I'm not.
Will they pass the test? Return to Jamie's Kitchen, Tuesday at 9 on 4.
Go north 200 metres, Calvin.
Turn the cameras off.
Britain's elite fighting unit.
These guys don't mess around.
The SAS.
It's kill or be killed.
Place the frame charge, move back to the safety of the balcony.
For the first time ever, the full and untold story of the regiment's history and victories.
Bang, 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 bang.
And the people who were there.
He was still sat with his back to me when I blotted him.
The ambition of any SAS soldier is to survive whatever it is he's doing.
SAS, the real story. Monday at 9 on 4.